From Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if it's okay with you, I would very much like to begin our discussion of the works, the feature film works of the extraordinary, the one-of-a-kind filmmaker, the one, the only, David Cronenberg. The feature film filmography is a fascinating one. David Cronenberg's filmography is a fascinating one. And oftentimes in the feature film category, such filmography starts with a work which is from 1969. It's approximately 62 or 63 minutes, so perhaps it might be deemed to be a short film in the feature film category, if you will. It's not necessarily considered to be a short film per se, but it is a feature film with, say, a short running time. It is considered to be, or it's oftentimes described as being, an experimental film, an expanded type of student film of sorts. It's also considered to be a film that maybe is setting the scene or laying the groundwork for a lot of the themes and concerns of Cronenberg that we will see expressed throughout his filmography, and that's certainly the case. It is also, I would say, in and of itself, directly and uniquely, a fascinating work. It's often described also as being a cerebral type of science fiction film, and I think that is certainly the case. It is also, from my viewpoint, so thoroughly engaging, and I believe it's very entertaining, and I'll try to explain the reasons why I feel that way throughout the course of this video. It is the work from 1969, and it is called Stereo. This is the Arrow Video single disc release of this, which is, they released it under the title David Cronenberg's Early Works. There are a number of early works here, plus a really nice discussion with Kim Newman. I like this particular Arrow Video release for a reason which I'll get to momentarily. I should say also that you can find the film as a supplement or an extra on other releases of films by David Cronenberg. For instance, David Cronenberg's film Fast Company, this Blu-ray release, has, from Blue Underground, has Stereo as one of the extras. Also, the Criterion Collection released a Blu-ray of David Cronenberg's work, Scanners. And on the supplements, we have, again, the film Stereo, which I think is a very good inclusion with this film, Scanners, because for reasons which we'll get into later, there are some connections, very interesting connections between Scanners and the film Stereo. Before I get into a specific discussion of the film, I should say that I will be talking about very specific plot details, and so if you haven't seen the film Stereo, then maybe I would suggest that you can turn off this video and watch the film, and then you can come back to this video at any time in case you're interested, because again, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. I will say before we start the conversation in earnest that I think this film has a reputation, or I understand that this film, or my understanding is that the film has a reputation for being somewhat cerebral and very much feeling like it might be seen to be a type of academic exercise in many ways, which makes it very fascinating as a subject matter of cinema discussion, but perhaps impenetrable in terms of a piece of entertainment from the mind of David Cronenberg. And I can certainly see that particular viewpoint as it exists, or as it might exist. And so maybe in that way, especially when we think about the other films to come from David Cronenberg, there are a number of, or a great number of landmark moments, iconic moments that could be described to be, say, in the category of, say, science fiction or horror or intense drama, that also have in those roots a type of strong sense of entertainment, as well as capturing or embodying those themes or elements that could be described as being part of the David Cronenberg aesthetic, visual and a type of cinematic or cerebral aesthetic. So that might be those films, therefore, I think, are, for many, the source of the reason why David Cronenberg is so popular the way he is, and he has such a great following of fans and admirers the way he does. And so in that way, perhaps, when one looks at a film like Stereo, one sees a very type of experimental, or what might be described as an experimental mode of filmmaking, which almost shockingly might be seen to be very different from, as I say, the later modes of cinematic expression that we will find in his filmography in going forward. If you feel that way about this film, Stereo, when you see it, that's, I think, perfectly fine. That is a very reasonable approach to have. As I say, it is a very challenging work. At the same time, however, or perhaps if I could express my own viewpoint, again in very general terms on this film, I find this film so fascinating, and thus I find it very entertaining, and I will try to explain why. I really do. This is such an entertaining film for me, and it's so quirky, and it has this interesting, very dynamic way in which sound and image are connected or disconnected. There are things and story elements that are revealed very subtly, which show us this progression or story of these particular individuals that we see. And it is fascinating. And the hints and the clues as to what these people are going through as we watch this film Stereo, and the way that that information is slowly building and slowly revealing itself through this incredibly cerebral, charged, almost esoteric sounding type of academic-based dialogue narration that is overlaid on the film, which is part of the conceit, which I'll get to later on in this video. Within that, we have the revelation of information, and this revelation of information as the film progresses is, to me, one of the fascinating aspects of this. And it's a type of mystery that builds and builds and builds until you get a type of denouement, as it were. And so that also lends itself to me to be a great source of entertainment. So I find this film, Stereo, to be such a fascinating work, and I'm so excited for this particular discussion again. So if you haven't seen the film, then I would, and if you're interested in the works of David Cronenberg, then I would suggest, I could recommend this film for you. It's not a film for everyone, that's for sure. And so if you watch it and you think, oh, it's not my cup of tea, that's okay, not a problem. There are many other works of David Cronenberg that we will talk about later that I hope maybe to hear your thoughts and comments on as we go forward. So again, if you watch the film Stereo and it's not for you, that's perfectly okay. But at the same time, if you watch the film Stereo and you are interested in a discussion on it, let us go forward, my dear friends, with that, talking about David Cronenberg's film from 1969, Stereo. And so now, my friends, let us now speak about specifics of this film Stereo. The work is a conceit, or the conceit is based upon this Canadian Academy of Erotic Inquiry, CAEE. And so therefore the film Stereo is described in its subtitles being a Tile 3B of a CAEE educational mosaic. And all CAEE educational audiovisual titles designate SAVC field OT are exposure restricted in accordance with the provisions of the Canadian Plastic Forms Act. So right off the bat, with the title sequence, we have the conceit revealed, which is that this is a scientific study film which seems to be cataloging in some form the study of psychic research involving a group of individuals which we understand to have, through a set of circumstances scientifically applied, some kind of power of telepathy, ESP, extrasensory perception, the ability to maybe hear thoughts or communicate or to otherwise engage with other people beyond the senses, beyond the sensory. And so this film, Stereo, the conceit of this film is as a type of audio-visual, educational, scientific survey or research or a report, if you will, of this particular psychic telepathic study. So that's the conceit. And so we have, as part of that conceit, the narration, which is an explanation of the various facets of this study. And we have, at the same time, we see images or scenes of people in this particular environment, which we think has something to do with the telepathic subjects. And we think that these people are probably in some capacity involved with this particular telepathic psychic research. So this is the basic conceit. Now, as the film plays itself out and as it runs along, we have various blocks or chapters of the narration. It's not just one narrator singularly narrating throughout the course of the work, but we have blocks or chapters of narration from various narrators, not just one, but various narrators. Each block or chapter of narration is oftentimes, or it is definitely, associated with some kind of visual scene or expression, which may or may not be directly connected. So there could be a connect, or there could be a disconnect. And I'll try to explain that very fascinating and dynamic relationship as we go along. But the conceit is further established by the fact that we have this academic sounding narration from various narrators who seem to be involved with the research involving this particular scientist, and we understand the name of the scientist later is Dr. Luther Stringfellow. But each block or chapter of narration seems to be focusing in on a particular component. Now, I've counted maybe about 17 of these particular groups of narration. And so what are those groups of narration? So for instance, the first chapter is focusing in on the very basics of this study in the context of what it describes as being experiential space continua and human social cybernetics, the study of the relationships, the dynamics between individuals, or to use the parlance of the film itself, varying dimensions of human experience in the context of man in his society. And the idea about how this is a gathering of 8, they say the specific number, 8 Category A subjects. And these 8 Category A subjects have undergone a surgical process by which of biochemical induction in order to establish an extension of that part of their human brain which will create powers of telepathy. And so this first block or chapter of narration is setting up the essence of the study that we will then hear about throughout the course of these other chapters. These other chapters are focusing in, for instance, on the concept of telepathic dependency, and also the idea of, or introducing the idea of the researcher and the subject, and with great and really wonderfully established words and the type of parlance, almost what might be described on the one hand as being a type of academic sounding jargon. But it really has, I think, a sense of purpose and place, and I'll try to get to that momentarily as well. But using phrases like dependency, or the dependent, and the object of his dependency, and the dependent altering patterns of electrochemical discharge to mimic those of his object, and talking about the parapsychological experimental gestalt, and the subject and researcher in the context of such parapsychological experimental gestalt, because this concept of telepathic dependency is then related into this notion of the researcher and the subject. And this is very important when we hear later in one of the other chapters of narration about the specific hypotheses of the scientist and the theorist, Luther Stringfellow, and the Stringfellow hypothesis and his theories. And one of the theories that's expressed of the Stringfellow theory, or one of the Stringfellow theories, is that the researcher must have a very intimate and emotional bond with his or her subject that he or she is studying. And so it's not just a clinical, purely scientific type of experiment, but it is an experiment that is wholly dependent on a sense of subjectivity between researcher and subject, almost to the point of a type of emotional bond. And that sets this type of psychic research apart from so-called classical research or classical experiments. Classical experimentation, again in the context of the narration or one of the chapters of narration, is described as being the creation of a closed environment type of experimentation such that the experiment can be repeated and mimicked time and time again by other third parties, whereas psychic experiments or experiments in the context of psychic research or telepathically based research, again in the context of the theories of one Dr. Luther Stringfellow, seem to be that instead of having this repeatable type of experimentation, in fact the experiments that are in the context of this CAEE inquiry are in fact non-repeatable, and they can't be mimicked. In other words, they are wholly unique in the context here because of these human relationships. And so we already get a hint of this in the second chapter of narration, which is again talking about telepathic dependency. And we get a further indication of this specificity and human bond, the quality of the human bond in the context, as I say, of this inquiry, in the description of the category A subjects, and how this is not an objective classification but is wholly subjective on the part of the researcher, described in the parlance of the narration, the great narration, as being the aesthetics of human form, erotic research. And so that implies a type of sexual attraction between researcher and subject. And that leads to other threads or lines of thought, again emerging in the narration of this, talking about the emergence or the transformation or change or the identification, if you will, among these telepathic category A subjects of the nature of the sexual identity or the sexual nature of these particular beings. And therein lies a very interesting conversation, and later on in the film, about various forms of sexuality, the norms of sexuality in traditional, say, societal contexts, whereas Stringfellow and the Stringfellow theories seem to suggest that, in fact, what might be considered to be quote-unquote traditional norms of sexuality are, in fact, the deviation, and in fact, in the context of this transformative nature of the telepathic conglomerate, to borrow a phrase from another of the narration chapters, we have the emergence or existence or the identification of what is termed omnisexuality. And so this idea, as it's also described as being an extension of what is often described as being bisexuality. So omnisexuality, again, in the context of the interactions between and among these category A telepathists. And so this then forms, again, the furthering of what is described as being the Stringfellow theories, and the Stringfellow hypothesis. And I think the Stringfellow hypothesis is described in yet another of these narration chapters as being the direct proportionality between the flow of the telepathic activity between two telepathically inclined persons, the direct proportionality between such telepathic flow and the emotional connection between those two individuals. In other words, this hypothesis is suggesting that there needs to be the establishment of an emotional bond in order for there to be a telepathic bond between them. And so this is very much inherent or consistent with other aspects of the narration that we've heard, namely the parapsychological experimental gestalt, which is another way of saying the connection between the researcher and the subject, the non-objectivity of the establishment of this classification, category A. It's very much part of the connection between the researcher and subject is very much a part of that. The way in which the Stringfellow hypothesis or theory is very much dependent on what is described as this telepathic dependency, which is also related to something later, the telepathic conglomerate, which is, again, in that particular narration, focusing in on the dominant and the subjects of such dominant person, the alpha character, as it were, that has the establishment of, or the suppression of heterogeneous elements in favor of the homogeneous elements, which then form the basis of this conglomerate or commune unit, which is described later as being perhaps a replacement for the quote-unquote traditional family unit. And this is also described yet later in another chapter of narration as perhaps being an indication of the steps towards what could be described as human social evolution, because these have a lot to do with the way human beings are interacting with each other. And interaction is very much at the core of the way in which human society is dividing into units, and the way in which those units are regarded, again, in the context of the broad spectrum of human society. And that is also not just societal, but also very much inherently political. And so all these steps, and it's also very scientific, and it's also very much part of the evolution of the human brain. And so there is an evolutionary leap that is also linked to societal leaps that are also linked to the political. And then, of course, it ultimately comes down to how individuals are interacting with each other. Again, it's in these great, wonderfully established academic terms, cerebrally presented, the parapsychological experimental gestalt, the telepathic conglomerate, the agglutinization of the dominant in order to suppress the heterogeneous elements in favor of the homogeneous elements, etc., and the like. But then in the Stringfellow hypothesis, and then borrowing what is described as being the motto of the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry, CAEE, or Amor Vincit Omnia, which is love conquers all. So there's this idea here of love or an emotional bond intertwined with the telepathic expansion of the human minds of these category A subjects. So all of this is part of the conceit. That is the conceit of this really fascinating work, Stereo. But that's not all. That's not all, because embedded in this is so many layers of complexity and playing with the form of cinema and creating mystery and tricking the viewer into thinking one thing, but in fact the revelation of information as the film progresses leads to perhaps different avenues of possibility and revelation of plot. That makes this film so much multi-leveled and utterly fascinating. Here's an example. I mentioned how this film's conceit is basically formed on this CAEE Educational Mosaic Tile 3B, which is this scientific film. And we hear narration over these particular scenes. Now the question is, how much of a connection is there between what we hear in the narration and what we are seeing taking place as we are hearing the narration? What is the connection? Are these words that we are hearing and this explanation, are these directly relevant to what it is we are seeing, or is there perhaps a type of disconnect? Here's an example. The beginning of the film has, or the first chapter of narration, speaks about 8 Category A subjects. And so what this means essentially is that we have heard, or the narration describes the study involving 8 people. And so when we hear this, and when we see this particular scene at the beginning, which is the character played by Ron Walczyk leaving the helicopter and being outside this particular place, in this area, this very this incredible architecture, which is another brilliant aspect of this film, which is the visual style as well. But when we see this particular scene and we hear the narration about this particular point, there is a bit of a disconnect because we're not quite sure what's going on, right? There's only one individual, but we hear about this idea of Category A subjects and 8 of them. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that as we see the film, we will be seeing what we think is the actual study, the Luther Stringfellow study that involves these 8 subjects? Actually, what we will discover as we progress through the film is that that is actually not the case. What is revealed at the very end of the film is that this is, in fact, a gathering of surviving Category A subjects, because we understand that during the course of the actual study by Luther Stringfellow and company, there was a moment where 2 of the subjects actually killed themselves, according to the narration, and one of the subjects used a hand drill to drill a hole in his head. Now, he survived, but he had to recover, and there needed to be some time to recover. And in fact, the very end of the film, the very last chapter of narration, describes this study, and that sometime later, all the surviving subjects met again, and they had a reunion, all of them. And the 5 of them first met, and they had this reunion with the 6 of the remaining survivors, because he drilled a hole in his head, needing a couple more weeks for recovery, and then he joined later. And so with this particular bit of information, which is again revealed at the very end, the very last narration chapter, we can begin to interpret, or we can understand that this film, the likely interpretation of this film is that what we are seeing is in fact much later than the narration and what the narration is describing in terms of the study of Luther Stringfellow and the study of the theories. For instance, the subcategorization or the grouping of the 5. There's another moment where we see, or we hear the narration about 2 of the subjects having part of their larynx, part of their body removed, and also certain parts of their brain which had to do with speech centers were obliterated. And so we see, as we hear this narration, 2 of these individuals, a young man and a young woman, the woman being blindfolded and the man kind of cradling a model of the human body, and there's a type of interaction that might be occurring between them. And we're hearing this information on the narration track about these 2 subjects who again had aspects of their ability to create speech from their brain removed. Now, are these 2 subjects that we hear in the narration the same 2 people that we are seeing in this particular scene? Again, it could be, but maybe not, because we understand too that there's other parts of disconnect throughout the film. And so these are the examples that I'd like to cite in terms of the way in which this film might be creating a sense of connection or disconnection between what is heard and what is seen. And so if we can accept the fact that there's in fact a lot of disconnection between what is heard and what is seen, we realize then that the possibilities of what we are seeing is in fact, we are seeing the aftermath. And so if we're seeing the aftermath, then maybe what we are seeing or what we are experiencing is this true disconnect between what is seen and what is heard. And if that is indeed the case, then maybe this is, in a very interesting, almost meta way, a cinematic means by which Cronenberg is showing us a kind of outward manifestation of what is being described within the universe of the film. That is the Stringfellow hypothesis, namely that we are privy to our sensory perceptions of what we see, but perhaps what we see is very different from what we are hearing. And if that's the case, that could be a mirroring in a meta way of the disconnect or divide between the sensory perceptions of these subjects on the one hand and their telepathic perceptions on the other. The sensory, the real and the abstract, the sensory and the non-sensory. And the idea that while there might be a connection, there's also disconnection that we understand through other pockets of the narration. For instance, there's one area which is describing the schizophonetic partition of one of the subjects. And we understand from the narration that one of the subjects created a type of partition between the subject's telepathic self and true self. And so it was a division in order to protect this person, to give this person a sense of privacy, because the flow of telepathy is, in a sense, a type of intrusion on this person's privacy. And so in order to protect that person's privacy, according to this notion of schizophonetic partition, the subject divided the self into the true self and the telepathic self, in order, therefore, to protect the true self by using the telepathic self. But what that does is that essentially suffocates the true self, and it essentially supplants the true self in favor of the telepathic self, such that the telepathic self becomes, in a weird way, a type of true self. And the narration here is over this particular moment between a young woman who has blonde hair and a young man with sort of dark curly hair, and they seem to be having this very sexual, erotic encounter, and they have what appears to be a mutual attraction towards each other. And so on the one hand, one might think that this subject that we are hearing on the narration, which is the schizophonetic partition, has to do with one of these people. Maybe it's the young woman, we're not sure. But if that's the case, then it seems very odd, right? Because we are hearing about this idea of the separation between the true self and the telepathic self, but at the same time, we are seeing a scene where these two peoples appear to be very much into each other, and they really enjoy each other's company. So there seems to be this interesting divide. Maybe we are hearing about the particular people that we are seeing, but maybe not. And so that is, I think, and that divide too, therefore, is created in a meta sense in terms of the viewer and our reaction and response to what it is we're seeing. Maybe we are seeing something that has a connection to what it is we are hearing, but maybe not. And if that's the case, that is that type of paralleling in terms of what we see and what we experience as a viewer and what we see in the universe of the film, I think, is utterly fascinating. So it's already an indication of the way in which David Cronenberg's cinema, even at this early stage of his filmography, is operating on a very high charge level in terms of the type of maybe operation of the cinematic form, and how that cinematic form has this quite myriad possibility. So this is one of the examples, I think, of how this film has this really dynamic sense, and it's very tricky. It is a very tricky film because we don't get the sound from the universe. We have to be supplied information by this narration, and it's tricky too because the narration is very much part of this academic jargon. Some might consider it to be maybe a type of mumbo jumbo, maybe almost a pseudo-intellectual, and maybe that pseudo-intellectualism or sense of pseudo-intellectualism is in itself a type of parody of this type of approach to sort of academia. And I think if that's one interpretation, I think that's a very reasonable interpretation to have. But I can only go so far with that interpretation myself personally, because I personally don't think of the the narration as a type of a pseudo-intellectualism. On the contrary, I think it's very cerebral and very earnest, and it's very much, I think, true to form. It does use these grand, lofty terms, definitely, and many of them I don't, it's very hard for me to follow, and so I have to listen and watch many, many times in order to try to get at least part of it. But when it's talking again about these, I think the concepts are very much about connection and about steps of evolution, and also about ways in which people are connecting with each other, and forms. And another way to explain, or to label or to describe this process of the yearning to want to connect with each other. Another way to explain that, or to describe it, is using the word sexuality. This idea of how to connect, how to engage with other human beings. And this is oftentimes in the context of what is often what's described as being eroticism, or there's this in the phrases, or the phraseology of the narration, for example, the potency of human eroticism, the establishment of sexual attraction, leading to the establishment of a geometrically increasing rate of telepathic flow. There's also the idea of erotic morphology, and the idea that this is focusing on erotic shapes, but also and also erotic motions, and also the idea that between telepathists, it is not the perception of the actual thing, of the object of the eroticism, but rather the perception of the thought of someone thinking about some actual thing of the object of eroticism. So in that way, it's not in and of itself strictly focused in this quote-unquote traditional sense of sexuality in traditional societal norms of the phrase or the understanding, but rather it leads the way to, in the theory of Luther Stringfellow, something else, and it's described in this film as omnisexual. So there's these like lines of wording and language that I think it's a little bit hard to get into at first, but it has this rhythm, it has this flow, and it does have at its essence focusing in on concepts that I think are very fundamental, and they are very much, therefore, I think, very essential. And this essentiality, I think, will find further form and further expression in other films of David Cronenberg. When we think about other films of David Cronenberg in terms of the leaps in evolution, the creation or the effects of this evolution on the self, and the expression of sexuality maybe within or without this particular context, etc., etc. This is, I think, part, and this is oftentimes or sometimes considered to be part of the quote-unquote body horror aesthetic of David Cronenberg that we will see later on, leaps in human evolution and the horrific consequences thereof. It's all here in stereo. It is all here in stereo. So even as it's being cloaked in or embedded by this academic jargon, at the same time or as a result of that, it is still very much part of the spirit of these concepts and ideas that we will see, say, in other works of David Cronenberg. And in and of himself, stereo, as it describes them or discusses them, is so fascinating. I personally have this love of this film because I love how it is focusing in on the effects of telepathy. Now, this idea of telepathic powers, ESP, is a great plot, and it's a great story arc, or it's a great source of say, dramatic tension that's used in wonderful classics of the genre, for instance, like other films like Carrie or Brian De Palma's The Fury, or maybe another work by David Cronenberg called Scanners, in terms of telepathic powers in the context of this maybe science fiction, action, horror films. Those are great. Those are absolutely great. And nothing to take away from those films, of course, because they are operating on their own aesthetic. Now, David Cronenberg's stereo is arguably in the same genre or in the same tradition in terms of its dealing with these science fiction elements of telepathy or ESP. It is dealing with them, though, in a very different vein. because it's dealing with them perhaps arguably in a more in this more scientific study sort of way. And the scientific study sort of way specifically is dealing with the consequences of the telepathic powers and the consequences that are expressed in, say, human interaction, and the way in which groups are formed, and the way in which the idea of communes are formed, and the way in which the idea of the alpha character, the alpha subject, and the beta subject, and the dominant character and the subdominant character, and how these form human interactions that are also based on sexual attraction and also based on repulsion, not liking each other. I mean, what happens when you have two telepathists or people with telepathic powers that don't like each other, but still they have no choice but to communicate with each other because they have this telepathic power and they can't control it? What are they going to do? How does that manifest themselves? How does that manifest itself outwardly in terms of their interactions with each other? Does it turn violent? Does it turn ugly? Does it turn regressive? And those, I think, are very much part of the key. Another thing, too, is what are the negative consequences of these particular modes of say, consequence of the telepathic state. I mentioned earlier this idea of the schizophonetic partition and how you had this true self versus the telepathic self. And one of the ways in which the narration talks about this is that the true self will oftentimes try to reassert itself through what's described as telepathic self-emissions or violent images of decay, vampirism, disintegration, necrophilia, other morbid thoughts. And so this leads into this idea of a type of, well, it's described in the narration, which is the thoughts that are based on the morbid and the dark and the unseen. And so we have that as being another manifestation, possibly anyway, of the consequences of this telepathic surgery. And so there are these consequences that are very much part of the fabric or the progression of social human evolution that is both societal based and also political based, and it supplants, say, quote unquote traditional forms of the family unit in favor of these new telepathic conglomerate units, or in conjunction or in parallel, it might lead to other destructive elements as well. Again, the idea of resistance or the repulsion and the inability to avoid that. But how is that expressed? There's a very famous scene in terms of how this film ends. I was speaking about that couple that we saw around the middle of the film, the young woman with the blonde hair and the young man with the dark curly hair, and how there's a very famous scene in the middle of that film when they are having a very maybe intimate sexual moment. And they are on this bed, this table, and the light is emanating from the table. We see the hair of the young woman, and it's spread out in that way, and so there's this encounter. But these same characters meet again at the end of the film. And as you know, watching the film, their encounter is far from what it was earlier in the film. The young woman very much is very open, and she seems very almost flirtatious and welcoming to this young man, but he, on the contrary, is very violent. He hits her. He's very rough with her. He walks away almost in a sense of anger or disillusionment, and that leaves us with this young woman. The camera lingers on this young woman who turns, and she puts on the black cloak, which is the Ron Mlodzik cloak from the beginning, I understand, and she walks away, and then we see the distance shot of her walking away and from outside the building. And so this is a very much when we have this film, which is very much talking about connectivity and the Stringfellow hypothesis and the direct proportionality between the telepathic flow and the emotional bond between the two subjects. When we have a film that ends in this very cold manner, I think we realize that this is the consequences are also possibly very much destructive, and they could also lead to, say, the obliteration of human connections as well as the potential consequences for connection. So there again lies another distinction or another manifestation or expression or representation of what was seen, say, in the narration visual dynamic, which is the connection or disconnection between what we hear and what we see. Here we have it in the plot terms of the film, the connection or disconnection between the people and what the consequences are. And these are the consequences of this telepathic power that has been induced in terms of biochemical induction as a result of this particular surgery imposed on these 8 category A subjects. And we also find out later in the film that they were 8, but then they became 6 because of this particular part of the experiment where we had 5 of the category A subjects brought together, but they resisted each other. They didn't want any part of each other, but they couldn't avoid each other because they had these telepathic powers. And so of these 5 subjects that were in this subgrouping, 2 of them we hear from the narration committed suicide, and 1 of them drilled a hole in his head. And in fact, we hear, this is the second reference to the one of the subjects drilling a hole in his head. We heard it earlier when we talked about, or when we heard it was the second block of narration, where it was a moment at the end of that narration block talking about one particular category A subject with a statistically excessive dependency susceptibility quotient, and he wounded himself in the forehead with a hand drill as a means of trying to create relief of imagined cranial pressures. And so we understand later in the film that this is in fact, or probably, the same incident that occurred because of this particular grouping of 5 that turned into this quite violent situation, or we can imagine it turned into this quite violent situation. And in fact, we can probably deduce that the person who survived this ordeal of the drilling of the hole in his head is probably the character played by Ron Modzik, who we see at the very beginning leaving the helicopter. Again, there are hints of this along the way. We see him in the mirror, in front of the mirror, looking at his particular forehead. We understand at the very end that 5 of them, after the experiment was over, or after the study was over, they came back again for a reunion. 5 of them came back, but the 6th had to have some extra time to recover. And so this probably coincides with the very start of the film, with this character's emerging from the helicopter. He is probably the 6th person who is arriving at this particular facility, again, a couple weeks after the remaining surviving 5 have already met and reunited. So again, everything comes full circle. And that's another indication, I might add, of something that we hear not syncing up necessarily what we see. In fact, what we are hearing has this time lag with what we are seeing. So in fact, what we are seeing at the start of the film coincides with what we hear at the end of the film. So again, this idea of connection or disconnection, which is embedded in many layers, both in the universe of the film itself, also in the viewer level, and also in terms of themes and specific plot constructions. So it is all here, it is all fascinating, and it leads to further avenues of thought and expression that we will see in future David Cronenberg works. I'd like to say too that this film is so remarkable too in terms of its visual style. I love the way in which there is a type of reliance on geometric shapes embedded in the architecture itself. The building that's seen here is, I think it's oftentimes described as an example of brutalism architecture, and the way in which these harsh, almost geometric lines are almost imposing themselves on this otherwise environmental space that we understand is part of probably the Ontario North Woods. Although again, we can't be sure again in terms of the connect and disconnect that I was referring to earlier, but might be or might not be. But in any event, we have this presentation of these interior spaces. Most of the film is taking place within interior spaces, except for a few key scenes outdoors. I mentioned the beginning part. There's also some parts near the end where we have, for instance, the Ron Modzik character seemingly meditating outside. There's a shot of this, what looks like maybe a plastic eyeball. I'm not sure. It's a very mysterious object. We're not sure about that. There's also the young man with the dark curly hair lying down as well. We're not sure what it is he's thinking or feeling, but we do know that when we see him later, at the very end of the film, he is very violent towards the young woman with the blonde hair. So maybe he is thinking about something along those lines at that particular moment outside. But in any event, we have a film that takes place a lot within these interior spaces, the corridors, the rooms, the straight lines that are diagonal, or that have these geometric shapes down stairwells or things of that nature, and that are lit in a way that further augment these geometric shapes that again are maybe warped, or that are canted, or that are at an angle. And so that, I think, leads itself very nicely to this idea of order but also disorder. There's a sense of equilibrium, but there's also a sense of a lack of balance. And I think that also plays itself in visual terms to this idea of connectivity and disconnectivity that I was mentioning earlier. So I like, again, that's a further level of that particular approach or theme or interpretation of this film. And also, I do like the way that the film, as I say, it reveals information, or it gives clues as to what these people actually are or who they are, and it tricks us. For instance, one of my early viewings of the film had me espouse the interpretation that, for instance, the man with the beard and the white shirt, who is seen also briefly carrying one of the pacifiers, that he was, say, a researcher, and that maybe researchers are known by, say, their white cloaks, and the subjects are known by their darker cloaks. But in fact, probably the interpretation that this bearded man with the white cloak is also one of the Category A subjects who has come to this particular facility as part of the reunion after they have separated from the Stringfellow researcher-subject relationship, and after that feeling of withdrawal have developed their own, again, to borrow the parlance of the narration, their own telepathic conglomerate, which has been further reinforced by the addition of radio transmitters, which seem to emulate or which seem to provide a type of synthetic a telepathic flow, that's according to the narration, which then further strengthens this commune group dynamic between them. But again, we have to question whether that commune group dynamic is indeed true, because of, again, how the film ends. The film ends very violently in terms of a scene of separation rather than connection. So question or query whether indeed this group of people are indeed the strong telepathic conglomerate that perhaps the narration might have us believe. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, who knows. But this type of way that the film reveals information or doesn't reveal information, I think, is so fascinating. There's also the idea of the young man with the curly hair. Why does he have pills? What is the connection with these pills? What do these pills do? And what happens when the medicine inside the pill is put into the drink and of the young woman? What is the relationship between the young woman with the dark hair, the dark short hair, and the young man with the mustache and the sort of blondish hair as well? Are these the people that had the parts of their larynx removed, or maybe were the people who had their larynx removed, were they the subjects who ended up taking their own lives because of the subgrouping of the five, which ended up quite disastrously, according to the narration? Again, we know and yet we don't know. There are things that are revealed, but there are things that are not revealed. For instance, too, what is the significance of the pacifier? We see a number of people carrying the pacifier. What does that mean? What does that symbolize? There's one moment, too, where one of the subjects, again, the young man with the curly hair, is seen actually destroying the pacifier. And what does that mean? And after the destruction of that, remember, he goes to see the young woman with the blonde hair, and then they have their sexual encounter, or we understand to be their sexual encounter. So what does that mean? Is that therefore suggesting that maybe this is a symbol that needs to be broken in order to have intimate encounters with other people? Or maybe it has a slightly different meaning, or perhaps a distinctly different meaning. Again, also the idea of pacifier might suggest innocence, or a sense of maybe naivete, or the idea, or recalls the image of a toddler or a baby. And also remember too that maybe can connect to earlier discussions in the narration about telepathic dependency, and also the replacement of the family unit with this new evolved telepathic conglomerate unit, which is maybe having extensions beyond the so-called traditional family unit. And perhaps we might think of the pacifier and the recollection or the image or the maybe how it represents babies, and how when you have a baby, you have a parent. So the parent-child relationship, and how this can also be seen in many ways to be a quote-unquote traditional family unit norm. And maybe this norm is also, while it's also expressing at the same time a type of dependency, because a child is obviously dependent on, say, the older person, the parent or the guardian, for survival. Right? So this idea of dependency is echoed or paralleled in the telepathic dependency quotient that's expressed in the Stringfellow hypothesis theory, but also it may be supplanted or may be destroyed because of the metaphor, or it might serve as a metaphor that's being destroyed because of, again, in the context of the Stringfellow hypothesis, the family unit or the traditional family unit is being replaced or can be replaced by this new world order of a telepathic conglomerate. And so maybe that replacement or the destruction of the old in favor of the new is expressed in this metaphor of the pacifier, which again in a certain key scene is seen to be destroyed or obliterated. So who knows? We have certain possibilities and certain revelations of information that could go in one direction, but then could go in completely separate direction. Again, who knows? That's one of the great strengths of this film Stereo, in my view. It is therefore utterly fascinating, so entertaining. Again, for those maybe science fiction elements, the actual consequences of telepathic abilities, that's so entertaining to me and a fascinating aspect, as well as the multi-layering of this that makes for, I think, such compelling viewing every single time I watch it. And so I think let us end there in terms of the discussion on Stereo from 1969. I hope I've expressed my enthusiasm for this throughout the course of this discussion, because I really wanted to express how much I really admire this film. I think it's such a brilliant work, and it, as I say, it leads the way to other things. I neglected to mention too this idea of, for instance, the drilling the hole in the head. That is a very interesting detail that we will see expressed again in another film by David Cronenberg called Scanners, with a particular character in this film called Daryl Revick. But so that's an example of how this film is, in one way of putting it, is essentially setting the stage for the Cronenberg themes that we will see expressed or dealt with in other films. Also the interaction between people and among people in terms of sexual relationships. David Cronenberg deals with sexuality a lot in his films, including Stereo, and also the way in which science may or may not prove to be a type of salvation for human evolution. And we see how science may or may not be a type of salvation in other works by David Cronenberg, such as A Dangerous Method or even Maps to the Stars, etc. And also the idea of connection and disconnection, which can lead to very violent or isolating natures and aspects, which we will see in films like, say, Videodrome or Cosmopolis, etc. And also the idea of the divide between what is real or what is abstract and what is real, the sensory and the non-sensory, what is true and what is fiction. And we will see this play itself out in films like, say, History of Violence, for example, or even Eastern Promises. And then the idea too of the advent of technology and the consequences, both positive and negative, both liberating and terrifying, of evolution and development. And we will see this play itself out in films such as The Brood and Rabid and Shivers, etc., and The Fly and Dead Ringers, etc. So it's on the Dead Zone, etc., and even Fast Company too. And so, and at the same time, this film, I would suggest, stands so firmly on its own for those reasons that I was trying to suggest earlier in this discussion, namely the way in which it has this really strong, complex layering, the way it's playing with the form of cinema, the way it's revealing or not revealing information, the way it embeds itself in a mystery that we understand is ultimately circular, because what we hear is not necessarily matching up with what we see, at least temporally. And so for these and other reasons, I think it stands so strongly on its own as a very powerful and compelling work from David Cronenberg. Again, this is the work from 1969, and it is called Stereo. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.